You would imagine that there is something inherently gendered in sexuality, or in the many expressions and acts associated with sex, and this may or may not be true. What we do know is that the ways in which we have been socially and culturally conditioned to look at sexuality and gender have specific historical contexts. In this segment, we'd like to focus on some of these as an illustrative example of how certain kinds of sexuality have been historically gendered. Since we've been following the history of the term homosexuality, let's continue that discussion with this example. The ancient Romans, unlike the ancient Greeks, took a very strong view of male homosexual sex acts, but in a curiously class and gender-centered way. The Lex Scantinia was a Roman law that penalized any male citizen of high standing, meaning in terms of social and economic power, who voluntarily engaged in what they called passive sexual behavior with another man. That is, they were the penetratee rather than the penetrator.
Oh, Geeti, can I please tell a little story here about the man who proposed this law?
Of course, Thomas.
Well, legend has it that a Roman senator by the name of Scantinius was actually caught in the act of being a penetratee while having sex with another man. Scandal immediately broke out, and the ancient Romans, being every bit as gossipy as 21st century people, Scantinius' name was instantly mud all over Roman society. Now get this, not wanting his name to be remembered for such scandalous reasons, Scantinius himself proposed this law which penalized any high-ranking Roman if they were caught doing exactly what he was caught doing. And you know why? Because the law would be named after him, and his name would be remembered for all the right reasons instead of all the scandalous ones.
Thank you for that lovely and scandalous footnote, Thomas. More seriously, you can see immediately how class and gender stereotypes come together to construct a certain view of sexual behavior. Because from a societal perspective, to be passive or submissive went against the basic understanding of masculinity, since passivity and submissiveness were considered to be feminine traits, as well as characteristics of the lower class and slaves. However, for that same male individual of high standing in society, same-sex intercourse with male prostitutes or slaves was entirely acceptable as long as he took the active role in penetration. And here you can see how an otherwise neutral sex act is made highly charged by notions of gender conformity within socially accepted norms of masculinity and femininity, as well as of class conformity. Remember that discussion of alterity earlier? This is an excellent example of how gender and class share the same positions of alterity, with the male aggression and wealth on one side, and the female submission and poverty on the other.
Ideas of masculinity have molded notions of sexuality in other historical contexts as well. Let's go to ancient China for our next example. The Ishinpo is a 10th century Japanese treatise on medicine that is actually a preservation of a much older Chinese treatise. Much of it is like a manual specifically for men on how to live longer, healthier, more energetic and successful lives. Among the suggestions on how to achieve this are a series of do's and don'ts on how to have sex. And here too we can see the gendering of sex, particularly sex acts and sexual behavior, all geared towards the achieving of these goals for the man. For instance, the man imbibes the energies required to be healthy and long-lived from having sex with young, healthy women. And there are a variety of ways prescribed for him on how this can best be optimized.
It is important to know, however, that the ancient Greeks as well as the ancient Chinese saw certain kinds of sex acts that we now associate with the idea of homosexuality, not as defining characteristics, but as part of a broader relationship that may or may not even include such acts. So, for instance, young men who joined the military in ancient China were often mentored by an older man. This mentoring included theoretical as well as practical passing on of knowledge and expertise, showing the new recruit the ropes and how things were done, and giving guidance and advice on a wide range of things. Sometimes this relationship became sexual, but this was not a necessary part of it. Interestingly, this aspect of a many-sided relationship was often taken over by non-military men of the middle class on the assumption that if military men could do it, it was socially and morally approved. The same was true of similar relationships between older mentor figures and younger men in ancient Greece, a multifaceted relationship of which sex was often one aspect among many.
As a final example, let's take a closer look at something that we have briefly mentioned earlier, the historical context of colonialism and imperialism and its impact on notions of sexuality and gender. This is a very short summary of some of the ways in which Europe's history of colonialism and imperialism have helped to create many of the contemporary notions of gender and sexuality in large parts of the world. First, it is important to remember that the ostensible reasons given for taking over the economies and societies of various countries in Asia and Africa by European monarchs was the goal of civilization, what Rudyard Kipling called the white man's burden. Over 2 centuries of European colonialism have left, as you can imagine, a lasting impact on colonized countries.
Second, it is sometimes forgotten that the colonial goal of civilizing people was often preceded by the Christian missionary goal of the salvation of the souls of these very people. With all the good that they might have done, these missionaries laid the foundation of what were considered contemporary Christian codes of conduct, among them the strict enforcement of heterosexuality. The laws and penal systems of 18th and 19th century Europe followed, criminalizing and outlawing any form of sexuality that was not approved by Victorian prudery. Thus, in trying to understand contemporary debates of sexuality, a historical context helps us to see how these debates were constructed, socially and politically.